you to realize that by the end of the verses today, that Mordecai has got to be the most confused man on the planet during that time. I mean, he and his people have been set for destruction, and yet his mortal enemy has come to him with a royal robe and the king's horse and parades him through the city square, honoring him as a town crier would by saying, "This is the man whom the king delights to honor." And he says it over and over and over again. As soon as that was over, though, Mordecai's robe was removed. His horse is led back to the royal stalls, and Mordecai returns to sit at the king's gate. Kind of if nothing had ever happened. His people are still set for destruction. And yet, the king honored him. How confusing would that be? Now, if you're like me, and I'm assuming you're somewhat like me, but we often feel the same way, don't we? Confused. We hear about the end which we as Christians are anticipating someday. But we have these frustrating events which cause us to be unhappy and frustrated. And it's like, why? If God wants us to have a good end, why do we have to have such difficulties and suffer along the way? Why? Well, there's a lot of different reasons for that, but maybe when all of these things happen, we're just looking at things in the wrong way. I looked at them in the wrong way for the last 3 days. So there's got to be a better way. But pain is real and trials are real. Loss and conflict with others, they really do affect us. They affect us now. But it is what we should be focusing on, is what Paul tells us. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And I find I should be reading this verse daily. Maybe 2 or 3 times a day. I need that encouragement. Paul tells us that our afflictions are light. How many of you feel like your afflictions are light today? Not me. They don't feel light, but they're light in comparison to the eternal weight of glory. That's a pretty darn good promise. So despite the troubles, if we will really look for the good, it is enough to set our minds on a different, and I think a much happier path. Now, this is the kind of thing that we're going to learn tonight from Esther, and really from the whole story of Esther. Mordecai had temporary difficulties, which seemed quite overwhelming. But when things turned around, we can see those troubles and fit these troubles into a much larger picture of redemption and safety that are coming to his people. The book never gives the Lord the credit for his divine intervention, and Mordecai never gives God the credit. Now, we could speculate Mordecai might be doing so, but let me just speak from my own experience, so there is no speculation needed. I question every day. I have self-pity every day. Stop shaking your head. But often, I don't even realize, I don't even see God's hand in how He is making all things take place for His glory. I don't see it. And not only is it for his glory, but it's for honor in such a way that it personally benefits me. This story leads us to much, or at least I think, a much fuller understanding of the Lord's tender care for Israel, which is an example for us as his children today. So if you would, turn with me to Esther chapter 6, if you have your Bibles, and we'll begin. That night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the books of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Now, if you recall, the king's been anticipating, and this is why he could not sleep. This verse is purposefully showing us that this same specific night that Esther had brought him to the first banquet, and now she is petitioned for the second banquet the next day. He's got to make it through the night, though. And it is this cause of the king's anticipation that's making him unable to sleep. Now, some ancient commentators reported, and I read, that some of the kings of this time were actually completely illiterate. I can't speak, and they couldn't read. And that may be true, but being king means that if you don't want to read, you don't have to read, because you can get someone to read for you. Exactly. So, ancient writings reveal royal documentations, especially in the Persian Empire, were most often compiled in a narrative or in a poetic form, making the reading much more interesting and could calm a racing mind and hopefully create a little sleep. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Now, the events referred to here are recorded in Esther chapter 2, which is summed up with the words, "And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king." So what had happened back in chapter 2 was written down. And now the king is reviewing that. But there is a difference here. The only difference between those two verses are the names. The name Bigthan was in verse 2:23 is changed to Bigthana. I could not find a reasonable explanation as to why. But there must be. So if you find one, I would love to hear it. The timing of the events clearly shows the presence of the Lord. And we're going to see that. The king can't sleep. The record books are then brought to him. And it just so happens, out of coincidence, that Mordecai's records are read. And Haman is coming later that morning to ask for Mordecai to be hanged the next day. It's all coming together. See, Esther had a second banquet scheduled for the king and Haman in order to reveal her anticipated desire. That's one of the things that she was looking for. One of the things that he orchestrated. There's so many things in this story that had to come and place just right, not just what happened, but the timing had to be perfect. And on you could go with a lot of little details that evolve into one grand theme. The Lord is there, and He is directing the events for a determined, specific outcome. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Why, nothing has been done for him." The lack of any reward may have been that it was, forgotten due to some kind of development or busy schedules. Who knows? But it wasn't done. Or it could have been that the court simply didn't pursue reminding the king because Mordecai was a Jew. That's possible. Whatever the reason, their response came back to the ears of the king that had nothing or nothing had been done for Mordecai. So, several scholars note that in the Hebrew, that verse 1 denotes a very lengthy period of reading is implied. So the reading could have gone on all night. And as the sun began to rise, morning arrived while the books were still being read. So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had already prepared for him. The circumstances which follow are more than ironic, but almost, I would think you could say it's comical in how they all play out. Man has a sense of humor, and man possesses nothing which God does not possess. So, what follows, along with the exact timing of all these events, shows us that the Lord is directing them for the sake of irony as much as anything else. To entertain us, to want us to read more about what is going on. All Haman needed was the king's quick stamp of approval. And Haman's life, his whole life's ambition, would be complete. One can almost sense the eager anticipation which flowed through Haman as he enters the king's court. So, but something happens. The king's servant said to him, "Haman is here, standing in the court." And the king said, "Well, let him come in." Now the Hebrew more accurately reads this: "Behold, Haman stands in the court." So we're able to see him. It's daylight. We know he's there. Even though there were certainly other officers and people present, it seems that it was kind of an unsuspected or unexpected surprise that Haman would show up that early in the morning to the king's court. What could be going on? He's got a big party to go to. Probably needs to rest up. Both men are at this very moment interested in this one Jewish man. One desires to have him honored for saving the king's life. The other to have him executed immediately. Is the irony not huge there? And the irony continues to build, but I dare not attempt to build the irony any further. So I'm going to let somebody else do it. I'm going to rely on Dr. Todd Bolin from Digging for Truth. Now, I've edited this down. It's a 2-part series to make it much shorter. And this is actually the second of that 2-part series. But I play it for you because I want you to hear his enthusiasm for when he went and surveyed and worked in Iran at the city of where Susa was and what was left there. Because 120, 130 years ago, we did not have that information. It was all covered. The Dutch, I believe it was the Dutch, were the first to come over to the Persian area or the Iran area today and started their excavations.
Into the city of Susa in particular. And the background for this is that God's chosen people have been carried off by the Babylonians, and now the Persians are the world rulers. And in one of their capital cities, the city of Susa, there are a lot of Jewish people living, including a man named Mordecai, and this young maiden named Hadassah. That's her Hebrew name. And we talked about some of the tremendous preserved remains of the Persian Empire and just the greatness of the kingdom that those archaeological remains reveal. But zeroing in on the city of Susa, we talked about how big it is. This is a massive city, 700 acres in size. The biblical accounts record of the distinction between the citadel of Susa, where the royal compound was, the palace, the administration, the treasury, as opposed to the city of Susa, where the people lived. And so that distinction is precisely recorded, accurately recounted in the biblical text. And
God's fingerprints are all over it, even though he's not mentioned in the text. But we're going to talk about the palace. One thing you'd like to talk about is I think I'm pronouncing this right, the Apadana or Apadana perhaps, and the gardens. You can start there, Todd, please.
So yes, that's a fascinating area of the palace compound. So when Darius the First made the city his capital and started building there in the year 520 BC, that's about 35 years before the story of Esther begins. He brought in all these craftsmen and all these materials to create this lavish palace. The most impressive parts of that is the Apadana, and right next to it, the gardens. So the Apadana is the royal banquet hall. It's the meeting room. It's a pillared hall, so dozens of pillars, and then surrounding it, pillared porches, and next to it, the gardens. And so when we start reading the book of Esther, that's where we are. When Ahasuerus, Xerxes, is throwing the banquet that his wife Vashti won't come to, that's where it is. And it talks about the enclosed gardens. By the way, the Persians are famous for their gardens. They're in fact, the word paradise, it comes from this. It's that idea of this enclosed garden. And the author of Esther, chapter 1, he really elaborates on just the beauty of the palace and all the decorations, and just really kind of waxes eloquent to say, wow, look how great the Persians are. Of course, who's really great in the book of Esther? Who is really, in control? Here's a hint, right? It's not the Persian king,
yes,
as great as his palace is.
Yeah. As a sort of a contrast there, the picture of human power, and I think that's probably what the author's trying to draw out here, and it shows the eyewitness nature of it, all that, but the attention is always at war with God. It's a very fascinating thing, and that goes on today. Now, another thing that you wanted to talk about, Todd, in terms of particulars, is the King's Gate, and that's where Mordecai overheard the conspiracy. And I'll let you elaborate on that.
So there are a number of places in Susa where you can stand and say, this happened right here. And the King's Gate's one of those places. So they discovered this on the east side of the palace compound. It's the gate that provides access to the palace from the city. And so anybody coming in is going to, and it's a monumental gate. Now today, see a picture of it. The remains don't look so impressive. The King's Gate is what the archaeologists know it as. They found a statue there of Darius, very interesting statue that's now in the museum. You can imagine Mordecai and Esther walking by there. But not only that, Mordecai, the book of Esther tells us, was sitting in the King's Gate. And say, like, okay, well, that's nice. Whatever, it tells us he had some position, some influence, to be able to be there. Not just anybody could be sitting there in the King's Gate. And while he was there, he overheard a conspiracy. There were two of the king's officers guarding the doorway there, and they had hatched a plot to kill Xerxes. And Mordecai. Now, so this is not just an incidental note in the account. I mean, it's crucial to the way the story unfolds, because it's going to be that sleepless night when Xerxes has the records read to him, and lo and behold, we never honored this man for sparing Xerxes' life. Now, there's an interesting footnote that I didn't know until I was doing my research for my trip, but these conspiracies against the Persian king, I mean, they happened. In fact, that's how Xerxes later died.
The name Mordecai has been found in some inscriptions. Am I right about that? I mean, it's hard to make that connection, but is that correct? At least a generic connection?
Yes. So I don't know that we have the same man,
right?
But yeah, we have evidence of that name. The names match, and also the names of Haman's sons
Yes.
match. They had to have been written at that time, because later on they didn't use those names.
Yeah, and that's along the lines of the same point. The use of names, that's very important in the ancient world. Well, let's talk a little bit about the outer court.
So that when the archaeologists excavated the palace, and again, you can go there, right? And I was able to walk through, the whole palace. They discovered that the style of the palace was built around a series of courtyards. In fact, 3 courtyards, and that's a typical style that they found in Babylon. So it seems like Darius was influenced by some of that Babylonian Mesopotamian architecture, and these 3 courtyards, the archaeologists identified the inner courtyard, the middle courtyard, and the outer courtyard, and they were decorated with beautiful reliefs, which you can see in the museums. The museum in Tehran, more accessible to many people, is the display there in the Louvre Museum in Paris. And so just spectacular reliefs of different soldiers, warriors, and animals in glazed brick that's just brilliant and beautiful. The colors, like haven't faded at all, it seems like, in these 2,500 years. And the outer courtyard is the largest one, and that too, like I said, very beautifully decorated. That is where Haman was. So in the story, King Xerxes cannot sleep, and that's, of course, as everything in the book is, providential, right? Just so happens, like, what do you know, right? He can't sleep. And so they bring the royal records, and the passage that they just so happen to read is the passage of Mordecai's reporting the conspiracy we just talked about there in the king's gate. And so the king says, who is in the court? And they determine Haman. He's just arrived. And he's in the book of Esther actually says he's in the outer court of the palace. And we have that. We have that outer court. And he's waiting there to speak to the king about a very important matter. He needs to speak to the king about Mordecai. And in fact, the king is waiting to speak to Haman about Mordecai. Now, Haman wants to talk to the king about hanging him because he just built the gallows for him. Whereas the king, as you know, the story, wants to honor Mordecai. And so he brings Haman in from the outer court and gives him the commands. I mean, Haman, of course, thinks it's, the honor is coming to him. But in fact, Haman's going to end up parading this Jewish man, Mordecai, around the streets. And that just really gets under Mordecai's skin. And so we know the place. You can stand and say, this is the spot. But a lot of times, it's, it happens somewhere near here, or we're not sure, or archaeologists disagree, or there's a church, here. And so that's the tradition. But to be there at Susa, but there's no doubt. They found the palace of Darius. This was the palace that his son Xerxes lived in. Yeah.
So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now, though Haman is there to make his petition, he must first listen to the king. He gets to speak first, and only after this could he make his request. Had he come in at any other time and sought the king's attention, he would have been able to be the first to speak. The entire story pivots on the king's question in this one verse. If it is not made in the way it is made, for the reason it's made, at the time it's made, Esther would have been a completely different story. The king feels a debt has been unfortunately left unpaid, and it must be dealt with before anything else can be done. The question is asked in a manner which seeks impartiality. He's wanting to know what Haman thinks without knowing the exact facts. So no name is given, no circumstances are detailed. It could be something small or be something exceedingly great. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, Whom would the king delight to honor more than me? Well, of course. Think about it. He has been called into the king's presence before making his presence even known. He had been the brilliant architect of the removal of the Jews and how that was all going to take place. He was the only one invited to Esther's banquet the day before, and he was the only one who was invited for the second banquet later that day. His skill of leadership, obviously noted even by the queen herself, meant that the king's high approval of him is what was on the king's mind, of course. So Haman suggests something truly fitting for himself. The great and awesome Haman. And Haman answered the king for the man whom the king delights to honor. Now the word for, you see, is inserted. It's italics in the English language. But it's really unnecessary. You see, the Hebrew better shows the excitement in Haman's response. The man whom the king delights to honor? Oh, I know just how to do that. So let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Now, there is some argument between scholars about whether this is a royal crown for the rider's head, a royal crown for the king's head, or a royal crown for the horse's head. The Hebrew, however, is very specific. It is for the horse. Ancient Asians' monuments and those pictures that he was talking about that they've uncovered, however, show and depict the king's horses wearing a sort of crown-like apparatus on their head. And so that special crown or crest is something that would identify the king's own horse. So everyone would know that honor would be great if you're sitting on that horse with that crown. Then let the robe and the horse be delivered to the hand of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim him before him. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. You got to think Haman's head is just about to just swell the entire, encompass the entire palace. But not only does Haman suggest that the royal robe and the horse be furnished, but that at first all this is to be delivered to one of the king's highest princes, so that it would be included not only bringing the stated items to that person to be honored, but actually getting him dressed, helping him up on the horse, helping him in every way so he could be completely honored. Now, getting to wear all this royalty would do no good if nobody saw it. And it would only be a partial joy for those if it just was in the palace. That wouldn't be really that good. But it would be high honor indeed if all the city of Susa were to see it. He would be the hero of the common people. And anyone refusing to bow would be ridiculed by the masses. The irony builds as the highest noble prince selected for the task would in fact be Haman himself. Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have suggested." Ahasuerus had overlooked the saving of his own life by another, and he wanted that oversight rectified immediately. There was the highest of all the nobles ready and available right in front of him to carry out this magnificent feat. By the end of the day and before the awaiting banquet, the debt to the throne would be repaid. And Haman would still have time to attend, ready to eat, building up a great thirst and hunger, ready for the party and the banquet, especially after a day of strolling and announcing all day long whom the king delights to honor. Several theologians call into question the historical truth of the account because of these strange words. They ask, how is it possible that the king would have forgotten that he had consigned all of the Jews to death, and so honor a Jew in this way? Why? Well, to me it's quite obvious, and to other scholars of today's world it is quite obvious. Haman's words in chapter 3 never named the group of people to be destroyed and plundered. For all the king knew, Haman was speaking of gypsies or tramps or thieves or maybe the leftover Babylonians from when they were conquered years before. Haman was now within moments of the most humiliating defeat he could possibly encounter. Those dangling sugar plums dancing in his head just a few hours before have vanished. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai. Oh, don't you know that was a scene? And led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." It would be hard to fully imagine the mental state of either man at this point with these events unfolding. But it would have to be a highly sorrowful day for Haman, but a great day of joy, even if it was temporary, for Mordecai. After all, his people still face extermination in the coming months. Verse 11 introduces us to another set of twos here. Mordecai wears a special set of clothes and accompanying honors appropriate to his good deed towards the king in verse 11. Now in verse 8:15 coming up, he will again be noted in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. So we see two things going on. They contrast in that here the honor is temporary for a deed accomplished in saving the king. In chapter 8, though, it will be for a permanent appointment to the royal court. They contrast, and yet they confirm the honorable deeds, the character, and the skill of Mordecai. Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. Mordecai just quietly goes back to his routine life, waiting to see if Esther would prevail in her mission. Now, on the other hand, Haman was mourning. His head was covered as he's walking back to his home, which at that time was a sign of extreme and exceeding shame. You covered your face. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." Haman runs home to tell his wife and all his friends what has occurred. And thinking, I would think, most likely expecting them to say, "Oh, don't worry, dear. It's going to be okay. Everything's going to be all right." But that just doesn't happen. Scholars attempt to explain why it is that Haman is told by his friends and family that Jews are under some kind of divine protection. But if they thought there was some kind of divine protection for the Jews, would they have not said something back in chapter 5? See, they are completely unaware of any divine protection. It is the king's favor resting on two of the Jews. It is Haman who signed the decree and sealed it with the king's signet. It is Haman who desires to destroy an entire group of people because of his hatred. It was Haman who was deviant in persuading the king to make the decree. His wise men and wife are aware of the king's favor for Queen Esther and now for Queen Mordecai. And it is known now that they are both Jews, at least to the outer court. Maybe not to the king, and most certainly probably not to the king. But now Esther, remember, has sent one of her helpers to go and communicate back and forth to Mordecai. You don't think that gossip was not spilled? Yeah. So this verse finishes out a set of twos. Starting in verse 5:10, Haman began to consult his friends. There he consulted them to brag. His friends gave him counsel on how to really destroy Mordecai. In this, he called them for mourning this time, and they revealed that it is Mordecai who will destroy him. The two accounts contrast, and yet they confirm the hatred between the Jews and the Amalekites, and that destruction will come to an end. In Haman, we can see the truth of this proverb. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. He who rolls a stone will have it rolled back onto him. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet, which Esther had prepared. There is a rapid succession of events which have come about in this chapter. Just one day prior, Haman was bragging about being the only one invited to Esther's banquet. Now he fears the second. He needs time to think, but the time clock is not his friend. The royal court has come for Haman to attend the banquet. What was a point of bragging a few hours ago was now a time for fear and trembling. Seems like that's something that Haman demanded out of Mordecai at one point. And now it's back on him. Again, as we have seen on numerous occasions already, the divine hand of the unseen Lord is directing all of these events. If the account is true, and we can be assured it is, should we look at what has happened as just random chance? Just dumb luck? Or will we look at the events as marvelous markers of the Lord's guiding hand, leading Israel to a good end? The reason this is important to consider in this story is because this type of story is repeated throughout history with the Jewish people over and over and over again. Is everything that has happened to them simply one long string of chances happening to turn out as prophesied on Mount Sinai by the Lord through Moses? Or is it just random chance? I just don't think so. As humans, we are saved by faith in the finished work of Jesus Christ. The record of his life in the New Testament is sufficient to bring anyone to salvation if they choose to do that. But God hasn't just left that witness and said, take it or leave it. It's the New Testament. Read it. If you don't get it, sorry. He has confirmed his word, which points to Christ, not only in what Christ did, but in the history of the Jewish people. Israel is a divine marker of God's faithfulness to his word. He chose them to lead to Jesus by his word in the first covenant. And He has promised to keep them as a people until the end, despite their continued rejection of that same divine word. The story of Esther is a story of the unseen Lord's faithfulness. When our faith in the world around us is shaken, and if your own faith in the promises of the Lord are also shaken, take time to reflect on the unbelievable faithfulness of the Lord to His very, very unfaithful people. They have been surrounded by so many enemies, strong, important enemies, so often that all reason should tell us Israel as a people should have stopped existing long ago. But they continue to be relevant to this day and will continue until God comes and Jesus comes back. The king's favor is toward a wise servant, but his wrath is against him who causes shame. And all God's people said, Amen. Amen. Amen.